In 1999, a dark-eyed 6-year-old boy captured hearts and headlines all over the world. The story of Elian Gonzalez was charged with drama, involving a fatal sea voyage, a rescued child, intense family disputes, political protests, and international tensions. To gain a rational understanding of this highly emotional story, we can explore the events using the major sociological perspectives.
Sociological perspectives can be very important in analyzing emotional issues because they show us how our emotions are in fact socially constructed.
We always try as sociologists to take a step back and look at a situation as if we were not part of the events or the situation. It's not easy. It's not easy, and it's a challenge of sociology because on all social sciences we are part of the world that we study.
I think sociologists can also say things about societies or groups or collectivities that are in highly emotional states. That was certainly the case with the Elian Gonzalez situation, in which both in Miami and in Cuba people were highly emotional about it. But there were some patterns as to their emotion and the way those things were manifest in the population. And sociologists study precisely patterns of human behavior. And those of us who studied the Cuban-American community and Cuba for a while, when this entire incident of Elian Gonzalez broke out, we were expecting certain things to happen, and largely those things took place because we were used to seeing patterns.
Many in Miami's Cuban community immigrated to America the same way Elian did, via a treacherous ocean journey aboard rickety, unseaworthy boats. Most Cuban Americans oppose Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba and feel very strongly about their new identity as Americans. New immigrants who reach the United States are welcomed as the community celebrates another successful escape from Cuba. On Thanksgiving Day, 1999, one such immigrant was discovered floating on an inner tube off the coast of Florida. It was a young boy, just 5 years old, exhausted, dehydrated, and barely coherent. His name was Elian Gonzalez. The evening news carried the story, and immediately donations, toys, and clothes began pouring into the hospital for Elian. His American relatives were located, and Elian was released into their custody. Elian's father, back in Cuba, learned that his ex-wife had died during the journey and that his son was in America. He wanted Elian to return to Cuba to live with him, but Elian's American relatives wanted to keep him in the United States. They appealed to the immigration office to grant Elian asylum, despite the wishes of his father.
To protect poor Elian Gonzalez from being forcibly returned to Cuba against his will, and to prevent him from facing future persecution.
The Gonzalez family, the Miami community, and the entire nation were divided as to what the best course of action was for Elian as 1999 turned into the year 2000. Elian's father flew to the U.S. to try to get his son back. Meanwhile, in Cuba, crowds demonstrated for the return of Elian to his homeland. On April 22, 2000, federal agents, acting on orders from Attorney General Janet Reno, forcibly took Elian into custody and reunited him with his father. The seizure of Elian made for some dramatic and disturbing photos.
The bond between a father and son. Juan Miguel Gonzalez wants to be with his son, and that will happen now.
The government's action sparked heated protest by the Cuban community in Florida. After Elian's American relatives exhausted every legal option they had, Elian boarded a plane with his father for their return to Cuba. His departure from America was met with resignation on the part of the Cuban community in Miami. When his plane landed in Cuba, Elian was met with parades and celebrations. He had become as much of a celebrity in Cuba as he was in the United States. What issues in the story of Elian Gonzalez would functionalism address?
From a functionalist perspective, it was very clear that the government had a particular function to play in the case of Elian Gonzalez. And really what it did was more than just uphold the laws that had to do with things like custody and so forth. It really upheld some basic values that Americans have that have to do, for example, with where children should live and who should be in charge of children. And Elian Gonzalez had one surviving parent, and that surviving parent had every indication that he was a loving father, was able to take care of him. And the values of our society said that's who Elian Gonzalez should be with. In other words, he should be with his father, and the government had, therefore, the function of reuniting him with his father.
The government had a function to play, had a role to play, because it had to interpret the laws and of the land as it applies to the case of Elian Gonzalez.
Functionalism illuminates the role of the government, but Elian also functioned as a symbol for both Cuban Americans and Cuban nationalists.
Elian Gonzalez would not have gained that publicity if the child had not served a very important function for the different constituencies or the different groups involved. This was especially true in Miami, where Elian Gonzalez, essentially his function was to symbolize the ongoing struggle against Castro.
The imbalance of power in situations is an issue examined by the conflict perspective.
The conflict perspective has always stressed the importance of economic interests in determining, essentially, human behavior. From a conflict perspective, there are certain social class dimensions involved here. That is, in this case, ideology was more important than economic interests, because people, particularly in Miami, were willing to forego their economic interests, were willing to forego their best interests in search of this moral cause in order to serve this ideology in the anti-Castro struggle.
What elements of the story would the interactionist perspective reveal?
If you're looking at this at an interactionist perspective, it's very interesting because you have folks that are getting together based on their interpretations of a symbol, the Elian Gonzalez idea. You had demonstrations supporting Elian staying here, and after the decision was made by the government to send him back to his father, protesting that decision.
Both in Miami and in Havana, the child was a symbol, and people reacted to Elian Gonzalez as that symbol. For Cuban Americans, he was a symbol of the struggle against Castro and the fact that Castro was not going to win this battle, that they were going to win it, that the child was going to stay here. For Cuba, it meant defeating the U.S., essentially defeating the Cuban American community, in this case, by having the child returned. He was a symbol all along, and people interacted around the issue of Elian Gonzalez on the basis that he was all along a symbol.
The story of this young boy was a story that spoke to many people, that evoked passionate feelings, that stirred to action the citizens of two nations. To understand the effects of Elian's story, to understand how it continues to shape our society, we can use the sociological perspectives.